Okay, guys, today's lesson we're going to be looking at the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution. Much of what we're going to focus on are the causes of the Revolution and the purpose of the American Revolution. We're not going to get so much into the Revolution itself and the battles of the Revolution, but we are going to talk a lot about why the Revolution occurred and what was the purpose behind it. And a lot of that can be found in the Declaration of Independence, which we're going to focus on a good bit today. So the first thing we need to discuss is the end of salutary neglect. Now, just to review, salutary neglect was the policy that kept the colonies pretty much out of England's eagle eye. It allowed the colonies to do pretty much what they wanted. So even though there were laws governing the colonies, there were taxes on the colonies, England, because they were so far away and because they were doing their own thing and they were making money through mercantilism, England allowed the colonies to really get around these laws. In other words, they didn't enforce them in a strict, stringent way. Well, that's called salutary neglect, just neglecting to enforce the rules on the colonies. Well, what's going to end that is a war that the colonies in England are going to fight together, not against each other, but together against France and the Native Americans. And this war is called the French and Indian War in America. And it was actually a war that France and England were fighting all over the world. Over in Europe, it was called the 7 Years' War. But here in America, we call it the French and Indian War because many of the Native American tribes sided with the French over the English. And of course, the colonies sided with England as that was their mother country. At the end of that war, which, by the way, England and the colonies won, you can see what England actually gained from the war. They gained a good chunk of land in the colonies. But at the end of that war, there's a huge debt that England has to pay for. And England's view is that they were really protecting the colonies in the French and Indian War, so therefore the colonies should have to pay for some of that war. So they're going to end the practice of salutary neglect. England's really going to start focusing in on enforcing the laws and actually passing taxes on the colonies to help pay for this war. Colonists, many of them, some of them don't care at all because the taxes don't affect them, but many of the colonists are furious by this, especially in New England, in the northern colonies, and especially in Massachusetts and Boston, Massachusetts. That's where a lot of the issues are going to arise leading up to the American Revolution is up in Boston, Massachusetts. But there were protests all over the colonies. These protests didn't have so much to do with the taxes themselves. I think that is something that is a misunderstanding for a lot of people. A lot of people believe the colonists just did not want to pay taxes. That wasn't really what the issue was for the colonists. What the issue was that they were not being able to tax themselves. That was their view, that they should govern themselves. They should be able to tax themselves. They did not have representation in the British Parliament. And so when Parliament would pass taxes on the colonists responded with no taxation without representation. We will tax ourselves because we represent ourselves, but you do not give us representation in the English Parliament. So therefore, you do not have the authority or the right to enforce taxes on us. And so that cry, that rallying cry, no taxation without representation, really started the process of problems between the colonists and the British. You had lots of taxes placed on the colonists or enforced on the colonists, like the Stamp Act, which was primarily a tax on documents and paper goods, things like newspapers, playing cards, wills, any legal document. There was a tax on them. That was called the Stamp Act. The Sugar Act, which was a tax on sugar, it didn't affect as many people because sugar was mainly for the wealthy back then. Sugar was very expensive, and so the ordinary person wasn't really affected by the Sugar Act. The Townsend duties, which tax tea and paint and lead, and then several others. And so these taxes are going to lead to protests in the colonies. Where a lot of these protests are going to be taking place is, of course, in Boston, Massachusetts. Now, they're all over the country. South Carolina had our share of protests, but the big problems are going to happen in Boston. And what you're going to see is a group called the Sons of Liberty are going to form, and they're going to use all kinds of tactics to protest these taxes. Some groups of the Sons of Liberty are nonviolent and use just methods like boycotts, or they refuse to buy certain products. Other groups of the Sons of Liberty, other members of the Sons of Liberty, took it up a level and actually resorted to violence. You saw them threaten tax collectors, and in the case of Boston, they had a tax collector there that was tarred and feathered and run out of the city. And tar and feathering, of course, you pour hot tar over a person and cover them with chicken feathers. It wasn't just a humiliating act, it was very painful. That hot tar would burn the skin. And so that tar, when it came off, would actually take bits of skin with it. It was a very painful thing. And so the king in England, King George III, is going to respond to this violence in Boston by sending 1,000 British troops to keep order and to protect his tax collectors there, to protect his officials in Boston. Tensions between the two groups is going to increase during this period, and it's going to come to a head on March 5th, 1770, when you had violence in the streets of Boston between the citizens there, some of the citizens, and the British military, the Redcoats. Now you can see the famous painting of this event. It's called the Boston Massacre, where you have a group of British soldiers firing into a crowd of citizens who are unarmed. You see their captain is ordering them to fire. Well, this is propaganda. This painting by Paul Revere, who's famous for his ride in the countryside, but he also painted this painting. This painting is just propaganda. It's false. Reality is the colonists were throwing snow and ice, oyster shells. They were pelting the soldiers with that. The soldiers did fire, but they did not fire in unison. They were not really ordered to fire by the captain. It was more chaotic. And in the end, you did have 5 colonists who were killed. Of course, if they had fired in the crowd the way the painting shows, it would have been more than 5 that were killed. So that lets us know that this painting was not accurate. But this is the painting that many people in the colonies are going to see and believe. They believe that this is what really happened. And so the tensions between the two sides is going to escalate. Now, we're not going to have a revolution yet. This is 1770, and the fighting doesn't really break out for 5 years until 1775. But this is a step in that direction. Another step in the direction to war with England is going to be an event called the Boston Tea Party. This event was a response to a tax that was left on tea. The king and the parliament pretty much took all the taxes away except for this tax on tea, which was enforced. The Tea Act really didn't even raise the cost of tea because you were forced to buy it from the East India Company, which was a monopoly, and the cost of tea was actually lowered, but that was beside the point for many of these Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty, their point was, you don't have a right to tax us, that we will tax ourselves. So many of the Sons of Liberty dressed up as Native Americans. They thought it would be hilarious to do so. And they dumped the tea on these 3 ships into Boston Harbor as an act of defiance. Now in Charleston, you actually had Tea Party in Charleston as well. But in Charleston, they weren't bold enough, some might say dumb enough, to destroy the tea. They actually took the tea and it ended up being hidden in the Exchange Building in Charleston. And so because they didn't destroy the tea, the king's reaction is going to be different in Charleston than it was in Boston. In Boston, the king and the parliament are furious. They see this group of rebels as treasonous. They have rebelled, and therefore they must be put down. So the king and the parliament passes what are called the Intolerable Acts. In England, they call them the Coercive Acts, but in America, we call them the Intolerable Acts. These acts closed Boston Harbor. They pretty much made the governor, the royal governor in Boston, a dictator where he could call all the shots. The Intolerable Acts forced It renewed the Quartering Act, which forced people of Boston to house British soldiers. So if a group of soldiers needed to use your house to sleep and eat your food, you basically had to allow them to do so. And these acts were, especially the closing of the port, which destroyed the livelihood of many people of Boston. Many innocent people who did not participate in the dumping of the tea are going to be affected by these intolerable acts. And so the colonists in Boston are going to start storing up weapons in response to this. They're going to start preparing for violence. Their view is the king has gone too far. Now, what they have to be able to do, the leaders of the colonies in New England, they have to be able to convince the other colonies in South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, New York, they have to convince these colonies that this is an act of war and that we actually need to declare our independence. And that's going to take some time to do. All right, before we even have a Declaration of Independence, fighting does break out in Boston. The military commander in charge of Boston is going to send his troops to collect the weapons that the people in Boston have stored up. And in doing so, the people of Boston get word that this is going to happen. They actually find out before the troops go to confiscate those weapons. So they actually take the weapons from where they're hidden in Concord and they remove them from the warehouses and hide them other places. And in the meantime, when the British troops start marching to take these weapons, that's where you have William Dawes and Paul Revere riding through the countryside warning the people that the British are coming. The redcoats are coming, the redcoats are coming. And 70 Minutemen, these were militiamen who could be ready in a minute's notice, meet these British soldiers in a field basically, in a place called Lexington, Massachusetts. Uh, and that's where we have the first shot of the revolution. Nobody knows who fired the shot. It's known as the shot heard around the world because it did change the world. But we don't know if the farmers actually fired on the soldiers or the soldiers fired on the farmers. Regardless, in the end, several soldiers, I think 7 are killed, 10 are wounded, and the British make their way on to Concord to collect the weapons. When they get to Concord, they find the warehouses empty. They burn the buildings, and on their way back to Boston, you have militiamen, colonists who are lining the woods and just start picking the British off right and left using guerrilla warfare. The British viewed this guerrilla fighting as uncivilized, and it was the start of the war. Now, the question still remained, what was this war going to be about? Is it just going to be about weapons? Is it just going to be about taxes? Is it just going to be confined to Boston and the areas around Boston? Or is this going to be a war about something more? And that's where we have the Second Continental Congress come into play. The Second Continental Congress is a group of leaders from the colonies who are going to get together to discuss the issues going on in Boston. Now, obviously, if there was a second, there was a first. And at the First Continental Congress, they already had suspected that we had issues emerging. And the First Continental Congress made some action steps, but they did not ever decide they were going to stand up to Britain. Well, the Second Continental Congress, after weeks of debate, the colonists finally decided that we needed a declaration. So they're going to appoint a 5-person committee to write a Declaration of Independence, and the person in charge of that committee of actually writing the document was Thomas Jefferson. John Adams, who was on that committee, John Adams' role in all of this was to basically convince, through speeches, the other delegates that they needed to vote for independence. So even though it was Jefferson who wrote the Declaration, it was Adams more than anyone else who really pushed the Declaration through. And Jefferson and Adams working together are 2 of the most important founders in America. Another decision that they made before we actually voted on the Declaration was the colonists went ahead, the delegates there went ahead and made the decision to appoint George Washington, one of the delegates there, as the leader of the military. So we went ahead and prepared for war because war was already being fought in Boston, and we sent Washington to really lead the army there before we even decided what the war was going to be about. Now, when Washington gets to Boston, he sees he doesn't really have an army. He has a group of farmers, and he knows he's got his work cut out for him. It's a big, big job. And in the meantime, the delegates back in Philadelphia at the Second Continental Congress do vote to declare our independence from Great Britain. On July 4th, 1776, it was official. The Declaration became official, and the Revolution really began. It became more than just a fight about taxes. This became a fight about our independence from Great Britain and forming a brand new nation, a republic. Let's talk about the Declaration of Independence itself. Thomas Jefferson was the one tasked with writing the Declaration. There's a famous part of this where Jefferson wants to know why he has to write it. Jefferson's a shy guy. He's 33 years old. He doesn't really want to write it. And Adams says, basically, you are more popular than I am. You're from Virginia. And Virginia, because it's the biggest colony, really needs to be the head of it to get other Virginians behind it. And 3, you're the best writer of us all. And certainly all 3 of those were true, especially the part about Jefferson being a great writer. Jefferson was the perfect person to write this document. The document states our beliefs about government and our reasons for leaving England. So the very first part of the document, the very first paragraph, we basically say that we are writing this so that people will understand the reasons for us leaving England. And you should never leave another country just willy-nilly. You shouldn't do so on the spur of the moment. That if you're going to do that, you need to have really, really good reasons for doing so. And then the second and third paragraphs of the document really deal with what we believe about government. And we get a lot of these, Jefferson gets a lot of these beliefs from John Locke's theories about government, the social contract. And some of those beliefs are that our rights come from God, that it's government's job to protect those rights. It says that all men are created equal, that their rights come from God. Those rights include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life is easy to understand. Of course, we have the right to life, to live. We have the right to freedom, that's liberty. We have the right to freedom. And we have the right to pursue what makes us happy. And that would be anywhere from owning land to working a job we want to work, to making the money we want to make, to doing what makes us happy in life. Those rights, according to the founders, come from God. And that government's job is not to give us those rights, but to protect those rights. And then the last part of that is that if a government fails to protect those rights, or even worse, takes some of those rights away, then it is the people's responsibility to overthrow that government and to form a new government. So you can see where this is headed. That's what our founders are going to say we are doing, that there is a government in England that is abusive to our rights given by God. And because it's abusive, it is our right to overthrow that government in England and to form a new government. And so the last part of the document, the biggest part, is going to be listing all the things England has done to abuse America, to abuse those rights. And the person targeted is going to be the king. King George III is targeted in the document as a tyrant, as a person who has taken away those rights. Now, in reality, we know that England had a parliament. It was a parliamentary system. And so while the king was responsible, he was the leader, there was a parliament passing these laws. So that was important to understand. But in the document itself, we're going to target, or Jefferson is going to target the king as the cause of all of these terrible, terrible things happening in America. He's listed as a tyrant, as a person who abuses his authority. So then we have the revolution itself, and the revolution is going to last many years. It's going to take 7 years of fighting, and then another 2 years of making a peace treaty with England. The course of the war is going to take many twists and turns. It's going to be fought in many different areas. Washington early in the war is going to barely escape disaster over and over again. One of George Washington's most important strengths was his ability to escape and live to fight another day. Truth is, Washington wasn't a great general early in the war in winning battles. In fact, he got his butt kicked many times early in the war. But what Washington was able to do was escape. And some view it not just as Washington's ability, but as divine providence. They saw God involved in those escapes. Crazy things happened. Like in New York, it looked like the army was trapped and a fog came in and allowed Washington to escape. And they discuss how the fog came out of nowhere and lasted just long enough for them to escape. Things like that they see as providence or as God really allowing them to escape. As the war bogs down, as Washington escapes time and time again and is able to win some battles, the British then move the war to the South, and South Carolina becomes central in the American Revolution. And we have several battles down here, but then the British bog down here, thanks primarily to people like the Swamp Fox Francis Marion and the Gamecock Thomas Sumter, who helped use guerrilla warfare to push the British out of the state. And then the final battle is going to occur in Virginia at a place called Yorktown, a port city where, with the help of the French, Washington and the French Navy is going to have Lord Cornwallis, the British general, surrounded. And Cornwallis and his men are forced to surrender to the Americans and to the French. And that is where the revolution is going to end. Victory is declared, and the United States officially becomes a nation.